Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about Saint Anselm of Canterbury in a very influential, tiny little piece, or at least tiny part of one of his pieces, that has been labeled afterwards the ontological argument. It's been labeled the ontological because onto means being, and logical is logic, thinking, the way things are, the logos. So the argument purports to show that the very logic of being, the way being or reality is or must be, entails that God exists. So that's a very grand claim. So let's look at his argument for that very grand claim. So actually, notice the dates. This is 1033 to 1109 after Christ. So this is right in the middle of the medieval period in which Christianity was dominant in Western Europe. So this writing takes place in the context of people believing the dominant way of thinking of the world in this society is Christianity. Christianity is taken for granted, and that should be seen as part of the background. So in section 3 of the work, it's a short paragraph, the sections are paragraphs. Anselm puts forth an argument, a peculiar argument that has an important conclusion. And I want to begin with that one. So the argument is aiming to show that if you think about the logic of being, the way we must think about the logic of being, the way we must think when we think about reality is a particular way. Namely, that we must think of God as existing. God must be thought to exist. That's the conclusion. And it's a conclusion about us, right? It's a conclusion about the way we must think about reality. When we think about reality, we must think of it as containing God or there being a God. We must think of God as existing. But that's still a claim about us. And that's a different claim than claiming that God does exist or that it's necessary that God exists. Those are claims of reality. This one is a claim about us. God must be thought to exist. When we think about God, we can't but think of God as existing if we think about God in the right way. We can't have false beliefs about God. But if we think about God in the right way, we must think of God as existing. And he gives us an argument for that. And here's the first premise. God is that in which nothing greater can be conceived. And it's important to understand what Anselm is saying here. He's not saying that this is the essence or definition of God, that this captures what it is to be divine. Being Christian, Anselm thinks he's much more humble. He thinks that we cannot fully comprehend the divine essence. We cannot truly know what God is. However, we can know a lot of things about God. And one of the things we can know about God is that God is that in which nothing greater can be conceived. When a being that is intelligent, that is capable of conceiving, has intelligence, thinks of other beings, conceives of other beings, here's the fact about those beings. They are incapable of thinking of a being greater than God. This thought is closely related to the thought that God is the greatest possible being or the greatest conceivable being. They're not quite the same one. Anselm wants to say that no human can conceive of God fully, adequately. So none of the concepts that we have of God as the greatest thing fully capture what God is. But we can think of God thinking about himself. In that conception, God's conception of himself is adequate. And that is the greatest possible being. God's conception of the greatest possible being is himself. So we can think of God being the greatest conceivable being when we include God as one of the conceivers. If we're only thinking of us finite beings as the conceivers, someone that are thinking, the best thing we can think of is still not going to be God, because our intellects are just not good enough, not strong enough, not impressive enough to conceive of the infinite God. We're finite. So it is safer, says Anselm, to think of God as that in which nothing greater can be conceived. If you're thinking about something and then you can imagine, you can conceive something greater than the first thing, here's what you know. The first thing you conceive of was not God. And I use a capital G for God, right? This is not in any old God. It's not like Zeus or Thor or Poseidon, like beings that are, purportedly immortal and like have some of the attributes of gods. This is capital G God, like the transcendent ground of all reality. This is the greatest possible being as conceived by the greatest possible being. So it is that God that, if it exists, it is such that no being can think of anyone greater than it. That's the first claim. Our grip onto God is through perfections to greatness. And God cannot be, there cannot be a being that is greater than God. That's one of the characteristics of God. For any being that we can conceive, God is greater than that being that we conceived. In a different way of saying that is to say that God is that in which nothing greater can be conceived. So that's premise number one. It's crucial to grasp what that means. Premise number two is a bit complex, but here it is. A thing which must be thought as existing is greater than a thing which cannot be thought as non-existing. So this is a claim about perfection, about greatness. And it says, if you have two things, two conceptions of two things, first thing A is such that it must be thought of as existing. Second thing B is such that it can be thought of as non-existing. Here's what premise 2 claims. The first thing A is greater, is more perfect. A different way of saying the same thing is that perfection comes in different varieties, but existence, necessary existence, is a perfection. So if a thing must be thought of as existing, that makes it greater, more perfect than a thing that can be thought as non-existing. And that's the second claim. From this, it follows that God must be thought as existing. Why? We'll go back to the A and B case. If you think of a God, if you think you're thinking of God, you have a concept, and you think, oh, this is a concept of God. But then the thing you're thinking of is capable of non-existing. Then you can make the thing that you're thinking of be greater by thinking of it as incapable of non-existing, as necessarily existing, and that will make it greater. That'll be more impressive, more perfect, because necessary existence is more perfect. So here's what the conclusion says: the first thing you were thinking of, the thing that you could think of it as non-existing, that was not God, because you can think of something greater than that one, namely something that must exist, and God is that in which nothing greater can exist. So if you think about God properly as the greatest, most perfect being, it follows that you must think of God as existing. When you think about the most perfect being, it must be that the way you think is of that God, of that being as existing, because necessary existence is a perfection. So that's what follows. Notice that that's still a claim about you. It's a claim about your thinking. It's about a claim about your thinking about perfection. So it's perfectly possible or consistent with this argument that you're mistaken. There's something wrong about the way you think. So this conclusion is not a conclusion that God exists, that the world is such that there's a God. The reality includes God. Rather, it's a claim about the way you must think of reality. And Anselm's aware of that. This is just a claim about the way you must think. It's not a claim about reality or a claim about God. It is the ontological argument, which is not this one, that aims to show that God exists. Not merely that we must think of God as existing, that's this argument, but also that God must exist. Now, that's not a claim about us, that's a claim about God. And that's the main target for this discussion, for this exposition of Anselm's thinking. The actual ontological argument is rather complex. So before we look at it, I'll give you some tools, some preliminaries, some concepts or ideas or tools that would be required to comprehend what's happening in the ontological argument. And here's the first tool. It is a distinction between a priori and a posteriori. Those are Latin words. That means that which is prior, that which is, and that which is posterior, that which is after. So we don't translate those things for some reason, so we keep the Latin. A priori is applied to things like beliefs, claims, statements, propositions. And to say that some claim or belief is a priori is to say that it is prior to experience, to sensation. Or to put differently, some belief, some claim is a priori when it is capable of being justified independently or prior to any experience of the senses. So math is a great example. That 2 + 2 = 4 is an a priori claim because it is the kind of claim that you can justify, you can provide arguments for, mathematical proofs, regardless of what the world looks like, regardless of whether there are chairs or no chairs, tables or no tables, clouds or no clouds, right? The changeable world, the world that is given by the senses, does not matter for the truth of a priori claims. A priori claims are prior to, independent of. It can be justified and known to be true independently of anything you observe with the senses. So that's a priori. Math is, think of math, that's a good example. In contrast with that is a posteriori, that which is posterior to, that which is after, and that which is after the senses. Beliefs or claims are a posteriori when they are justified on the basis of the senses. So things like my shirt is blue, my car is blue, I'm 6'2". Those are the kinds of claims about physical reality that are grounded in sensation or delivered by the senses. They're justified on the basis of sensation or experience. Those are the a posteriori ones. So here are, again, a couple of examples of a priori beliefs or claims. 2 + 2 = 4, A = A, the necessary identity of every object, or some logical claims. If A is taller than B and B is taller than C, then A is taller than C. Notice that you don't have to know the actual height of A, the actual height of B, the actual height of C. You don't even have to know what those are. This claim is necessarily true. If A is taller than B and B is taller than C, then A is taller than C. And you know that. In fact, there need not be any objects in the world. There need not be any changeable physical reality for this to be true and for you to know it. So knowing these things does not presuppose any facts about empirical reality, changeable reality. And a posteriori beliefs are about empirical changeable reality. So they, of course, presuppose that reality and presuppose experience of the reality. So there are claims like it is raining outside. If I believe that it's raining outside, that can be shown true or false on the basis of sensation. The earth is round and so on. Those are the kinds of beliefs, claims that are a posteriori after experience, grounded in experience, can be vindicated by experience. Anselm's ontological argument is an a priori argument. Anselm, like Plato, was very moved by math. He was very impressed by the fact that reason is capable of grasping eternal truths that do not presuppose, do not rely upon the changeable reality, the senses, that we just given by the senses. It is more impressive to provide a mathematical proof of a theorem because it makes it necessary, undeniable, it has to be true, than it is to provide just some empirical basis for some belief. Empirical bases are more fallible, more subject to error. The senses can be deceiving and so on, and it is just not as sound, as credible, as robust of a belief. So the argument, the ontological argument, is going to be purely a priori, knowable, justifiable, regardless of what the world looks like, regardless of any empirical sensory fact. And Anselm's going to think, yay, so much the better. That means that it is like math. It is undeniable. It is necessary. It must be true. So that's the first tool for the task. The distinction in the observation that the argument will look at is entirely a priori. It does not rely on the senses. And because of that, it has the status of like math. It has to be true, regardless of what the world looks like. Here are a couple more preliminaries. Anselm makes a distinction between existing in the mind and existing in reality. And let's elaborate a little bit on that. Existing in reality is just like existing or actually existing. So I exist, books exist, and so on. So when we use the word exist, plainly, simpliciter, without any qualifications, real things exist. Existing in the mind is thinner. It's merely being comprehended, being understood. And he uses the example of a paint. Before a painter paints a paint, the painter thinks of it, conceives of it, understands it. And because the painter understands it, it exists in the mind. It's as a mental image or something like that. So it has a kind of thin level of existence that is being understood. So think of the Mona Lisa. Before Da Vinci painted it, conceived of it, thought of it. And before that, the Mona Lisa existed in the mind of Da Vinci. Once Da Vinci went on to paint it, then it was in the real world, in the empirical world, in the changeable world, the physical world, and there was actually existing. And to be in the mind is to be merely thought of. Now, the real world, the actual world, need not just be the physical world. Like for Plato thought that the forms were another realm, another world that was even more real than the physical world. And Anselm's not going to quite go that way, but he is going to think that, for example, God and perhaps math and things like that exist in a deeper way, in a better way. So there will be multiple layers of existence. There will be the merely being thought of in the mind. That's a very thin. Existing in the physical world, that's much more impressive. And the way in which God exists, it's just real. It's not physical because God is not a physical being, but it's not merely thought of. It's part of the real world in the more extended sense of the word real. So we'll be relying on this distinction. For our purposes, existing in the mind is very thin. It's just being comprehended by. Then reality is the real one, and that can be physical or can be beyond the physical, depending on what's actually there in the world. Second tool, reductio ad absurdum, more Latin that is untranslated. The literal translation means reducing or to reduce to absurdity. And for our purposes, what matters is that this is a valid way of arguing. And it's a way that reasonable people go about trying to prove things. And it's a strategy. It begins by conceding to an interlocutor a point that the interlocutor makes. It begins by saying, oh, suppose that what you're saying is true. And then in the way of arguing continues by illustrating how, if that were true, some inconsistency, some absurdity would follow. And because that absurdity or inconsistency follows, it is valid to conclude that the thing with which we began the assumption, supposedly the thing that was supposed to be true, that is false. And here's an example to give you a better sense of what reductio ad absurdum, the kind of argument looks like. So here's an example. Premise number one, suppose for reductio, that is for the purposes of showing that it's false, that the earth is flat. Suppose that you believe, okay, the earth is flat. Now, here's something that follows from that. If so, if the earth is flat, then the earth's shadow on the moon would look round. When you have lunar eclipses, that is the sun hits the the earth, the moon not hits, but the lights of the sun hit the earth, and then it creates a shadow, and the shadow is projected onto the moon, those lunar eclipses. If the earth were flat, then the shadow would reflect that, right? The shadow wouldn't look, say, round, because round is not flat. Or at least spherical. So the shadow of the moon would be flat, but it would not be round. It would not be spherical. But if you actually look at lunar eclipses, especially history of lunar eclipses, every single time the shape of the Earth looks round, or at least the part of the shape that it shows in the moon is round or spherical. Therefore, it is not the case that the Earth is flat. The assumption with which we began the argument has been shown to be faulty. If the Earth were flat, the shadow would not be round, but the shadow is round, therefore the Earth is not flat. That's a perfectly valid way of reasoning. For our purposes, look at the structure. It begins with citing a thing, and it says explicitly for reductio. That is, we're assuming this for the sake of showing that it leads to a contradiction, and thereby show that it is false, thereby show that reality is not that way. And then it goes through multiple different steps. At some point, there's a problem, an inconsistency, an absurdity. Namely, the shadow does not look like it would look if the assumption were true. And then look at the conclusion. It is the negation of the thing with which we began. The Earth is not flat. It's just the denial of the thing that was supposed for reductio. The original assumption was false. That's a perfectly valid way of reasoning, and that is the structure of the argument that we're going to be looking at in the ontological argument. So before we conclude, though, I do want to read the actual text. This is what we'll conclude for this time. This is the paragraph. This is the main paragraph in which the ontological argument takes place. So it's a relatively short paragraph, but it's a dense paragraph. And I want to read through it to get a sense of the density of what's going on here. So quote, now we believe that you, this is a prayer addressed to God, so this is God, the you is God. Now we believe that you are something than which nothing greater can be thought. Or can it be that a thing of such a nature does not exist, since the fool said in his heart, there is no God? But surely, when the same fool hears what I am speaking about, namely something than which nothing greater can be thought, he understands what he hears, and what he understands is in his mind, even if he does not understand that it actually exists. For it is one thing for an object to exist in the mind, and another thing to understand that an object actually exists. Thus, when a painter plans beforehand what he is going to execute, he has the picture in his mind, but he does not yet think that it has actually exists. That's a typo, sorry, because he has not yet executed it. However, when he has actually painted it, then he both has it in his mind and understands that it exists because he has now made it. Even the fool then is forced to agree that something than which nothing greater can be thought exists in the mind. That's the first conclusion. Since he understands this when he hears it, and whatever is understood is in the mind. It's a thin conclusion though. And surely that than which a greater cannot be thought cannot exist in the mind alone. Here's the main part. For if it exists solely in the mind, it can be thought to exist in reality also, which is greater. If then that than which a greater cannot be thought exists in the mind alone, then the same that than which a greater cannot be thought is also that than which a greater can be thought. But this is obviously impossible. That's the inconsistency that arises. Therefore, there is absolutely no doubt that everything that something than which a greater cannot be thought exists both in the mind and in reality. So this is a dense paragraph. It's a dense argument. It's a very influential paragraph. Pretty much every major thinker since it was written back in the 11th century has engaged with it, has had something to say about it. It's a very profound argument. And the conclusion is very grand. If you think correctly about the nature of reality, it follows that God must exist, not just as something you're thinking about, but something real, something in the real world. So let's stop here. Next time we'll pick up and break down the argument more carefully, extract the premises more carefully, and look at the force of the argument. I'll see you next time. Bye.